UNESCO Remote Radio Week 2021. Live on connectonair.com and remoteradioweek.org.
Connect on Air.
Remote Radio Week proposes distinct programs in English, French. UNESCO Remote Radio Week 2021. Get ready for a week devoted to helping radio stations broadcast remotely. Live on connectonair.com and remote-radio-week.org.
Hello everyone, welcome to this session. My name is Dr. Laurie Hallett, and with me is Olya Booyar from the ABU. She's the head of radio there, and talking about radio in crisis, which is often dominated by COVID, but at the moment that's just the thing of the day. There are lots of other things going on. And I wanted to start, Olya, if I may, by asking you about, let's get that out of the way first, the COVID situation, because it's such a big region. Can you give us some examples of how radio has played a part in your part of the world?
Thank you, Laurie. It's great to be with everybody here. Look, the Asia Pacific region is a huge region, and our remit as ABU, we have 250 plus members in the region, and we start from Turkey, Russia, up north, and go through the Central Asia, all the stands, down to India, the subcontinent, Southeast Asia, Asia, and the Pacific, of course, as well as Australia and New Zealand. So it's a huge area to think about. And in terms of COVID, the region has been hit in various ways during various times. So in the beginning, when COVID swept through Asia itself, and it sort of, continued down, there quite a few of our members did very well. I mean, everyone pivoted really reasonably well to remote broadcasting, as in broadcasting from home, and did it very quickly. And of course, with radio, it's so much easier. And the thing is that radio in the Asia and the Pacific is a crucial medium. It's very important to most of the people. It's in many countries the only medium there is, particularly in the Pacific. There are some islands that don't currently have TV services that are their own TV services. They tend to get them from other islands. So radio is a means of information that is local, that is correct, and that is viewed as the source for the country and the region. So it's been sort of varied, but it's been very full on at the same time. So whereas it started off in Asia with COVID, but going down to Sydney, for example, and Australia as a whole, 2019 at the end of the year started with a lot of the fires, as people would have remembered. And that was a disaster on its own. Radio was crucial, absolutely crucial in keeping people alive, keeping people informed, and keeping people entertained during a very difficult and very scary time. And of course, within weeks, it pivoted straight from the fires into COVID. So in a way, radio was well positioned in Australia because it had gone from one disaster straight into another. And then right across, if we look now at the Pacific has just started in the last couple of months feeling the brunt of COVID and the restrictions. Up until now, they have, of course, they've gone through an economic crisis because of the shutdowns, and the economy so much depends on tourism that they haven't been able to cope very well without it. So it has been very different, but radio has maintained its role as the medium that keeps people entertained, keeps people very well informed, and keeps on track with what's going on, particularly in the area of trust, which has been hugely important for the last almost 2 years now.
So when you're talking about the role of radio, obviously it's quite easy to get caught up in the technology that allows us to do things today that even 5-10 years ago would have been very, very difficult to do. But what about the processes behind this? What about how organisations are coping with the wider impacts of crisis management? So, in the example of the fires, of course, there are lots of examples of where radio stations have been physically damaged, and the technologies which allow us to broadcast from home have allowed those organisations to continue broadcasting. But what does the ABU do in terms of supporting the organisations behind those stations to help them?
Look, that's a great question. And ABU's actually been running quite a few programs over the last years, almost more than a decade ago, with climate change, disaster risk reduction. And a lot of that has to do with having plans in place. Their broadcasting plans as well as broadcast plans, so the broadcast technology as well as the broadcast plans, on air plans. And that is really of utmost importance, because while radio can pivot very quickly and very easily, but you have to have a plan to do all of that. So we work with our broadcasters right across the board, particularly in Southeast Asia. I mean, Southeast Asia and the Pacific are prone to many natural disasters. So in fact, COVID, while it was a disaster of huge proportions around the world, in terms of disaster broadcasting and radio broadcasting per se, it didn't, apart from actually having people broadcast from home, it hasn't been such a huge impact, because our members are so used to having natural disasters and climate disasters, all sorts of things that are going on. I mean, you look at our members in Bangladesh, our members in Indonesia. I've already mentioned Australia and other places. These repeat over and over again every year. In Japan, we also have member-to-member contact. So our members actually train other members. So NHK Japan, one of our founding members, as well as the ABC in Australia, they take on the mantle of training other members in disaster broadcasting, in disaster risk reduction, and particularly doing the planning for the disaster, so they can very quickly pivot their broadcasting schedules, their announcements, and the rest of it. So it like I said, while it has been a huge issue, we have been very well prepared through a lot of the work that we do, not just in content, but in technology as well. I mean, I think, as you probably know, ABU actually invented the first radio in the box many years ago. And that has been something that we've tried to get out to our members, particularly in remote areas. But we're now working on the next iteration of that is much smaller and more cost effective.
You may remember him, and I just pay tribute to someone who passed away some while ago, Martin Allard, who was involved in a lot of that development of those systems. But I wonder, obviously technology solves a lot of problems, but the technology of radio becomes more complex. Does that mean that sometimes the complexity of modern day systems makes them more difficult to sustain in disaster situations?
I don't think so, because I mean, in a way, a lot of our members, what I've seen, that they've made a big leap from, like 10 years ago, there was a huge focus on digitizing, and to transition to digital. And for many of our members, they've gone from analog actually and leapt over that and made the leap to online, which is not as expensive. But also it's a lot easier to manage. And of course, you have, if you don't have a signal, you don't have a radio station. But in many places, in the Pacific, for example, a lot of broadcasting takes place via Facebook, via Facebook Live. Any disasters that take place, they go through there. Why? Is because there's now a marine cable that goes into many of the islands. And I know Australia as well as New Zealand are working on that, and China to a degree, and they're extending that infrastructure to be able to cope. So while, yes, if you're talking about the high end of broadcasting, it is complex and it will be difficult. But with radio, it doesn't always rely on that. You can actually broadcast online, and you can broadcast very quickly and very efficiently, even from home, with a very simple setup.
Is there a difference though between the covering of emergency situations in urban areas and in the rural parts of your vast part of the world, where connectivity is intrinsically tends to be more limited?
Yes, there is. I mean, national broadcasters in urban areas have a huge role to play, but also in rural areas, because often, because of the service guarantees, the national broadcasters are the only ones who are out in the rural areas, and of course, there are huge numbers of community broadcasters. I mean. ABU has very big members like BNNRC from Bangladesh, ACORAB from Nepal, and they have hundreds of stations all over the countries. And the beauty about that is that they're very local. They go down to the village level. So I think in that case, they work hand in hand with national broadcasters to be able to cover down to the smallest village and area, to be able to get the messages through. And often are there the messages that the national broadcasters have broadcast, and then they sort of get them out to every other broadcaster and community broadcaster in the country.
Just taking it away from the broadcaster side of things as we come to the end of this session, audiences, how have audiences reacted, and how have audiences perhaps changed over the last 2 or 3 years?
Well, we've noticed what other people have noticed around the world is that audiences have gone very local. They've turned inwards a lot. And that's it's not a bad thing necessarily, because people have actually started to really believe in their local radio stations, their local radio personalities, and they trust the local people around them, because I guess they see that they're going through the same thing. They can empathize. They know them. They remember them, and it's something very familiar in a situation that is just so unfamiliar and so difficult to comprehend. So the localism has been something that's been really interesting to watch. So much so that I think we're now looking at what happens beyond this. How do we get back to that sort of the diversity aspect, and looking at globalism? Has it been lost? I don't know. I mean, we're just starting to get out of that, but certainly the localism has been a massive impact, and not always a bad one at that, because people got to know their neighbors, they got to know their surroundings, they got to know their local areas, and by and large, that's been a very good thing for everybody.
Let's wrap up by just asking you about trust in broadcasting, and how that has been impacted by recent events. Do you feel that in the future radio will be able to retain its position as often the most trusted medium? Have there been any things that have impacted against that because of recent changes?
Look, I think like every other medium, radio has to fight for that. I mean, trust is a huge issue, and it's been a huge issue for several years now. And the pandemic's only really compounded it. So there's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of disinformation, and that foments mistrust in everything. So radio's probably slightly better off. Probably because, again, of that local aspect where people kind of know each other much more. But still, I mean, many of our members are saying that is their number one issue, is how do they work on the trust and making sure that people understand what they're doing. And it's a very difficult thing, because whereas in a lot of the stuff that you see or people see on the social media doesn't have to be verified, but broadcasters need to verify everything. They need to have sources. They can't just go off and, blithely report on whatever, anybody else is doing without actually verifying anything. But people are coming around to the fact that it actually is a good thing. It may be a little slower, but the news that you get from certain broadcasters is trustworthy, and people are starting to realize that. And in fact, I mean, I'm currently in Australia, and the funniest thing about this whole absolute terrible mess that we've had with the procurement of vaccines, and we've been late to the party, the whole thing, but there was such an issue about anti-vaxxers in Australia, and people were so uptight about it. And in the end, right now in New South Wales, where I live, we've got we're just about 95% vaccinated throughout the entire 16 plus population. And the biggest problem now is that the vaccine hesitant people, or not hesitant, is that the anti-vaxxers are really surprised that they're only less than 2% of the population. So the weight of that is not what it seems like when you're listening to all the amplification of the anti-vaxxers. So I think that's been a really good lesson for everybody, is that don't believe everything you hear.
That's great to hear. Olya Booyar, thank you very much for that quick canter through. I'm sorry the session was so short, but I hope people found it interesting. Thank you very much once again.
Pleasure. Thank you.
UNESCO Remote Radio Week 2021. Get ready for a week devoted to helping radio stations broadcast remotely. Live on connectonair.com and remote-radio-week.org.
Connect